Hi, Renovation Community, and anyone else who's watching. There's this weird story in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, where people who know Jesus since he was a boy rushed as a mob to kill him. They got up to drive him out of town and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Of course, Luke doesn't even answer the question we're all dying to know. How did Jesus slip through an entire mob of people unnoticed? But Luke does tell us why the people were so angry they wanted to kill him. It was for something he said. As he was speaking in his hometown synagogue, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this." And the very next verse, verse 29 says, "They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff." This tells us there's something pretty scandalous about these two stories. Jesus takes a point from them to drive home a message people in Nazareth do not want to hear. Let's use that filter as we study this story of Naaman from 2 Kings chapter 5. It's easy to understand, so easy that a child can get all the main points, but it's so controversial that God's people are willing to murder over it. As a reminder, since October, we've been walking through the 52 major stories of the Bible. Last week, I talked from 1 Kings chapter 18 on the prophet Elijah and the showdown God worked through him on Mount Carmel against the prophets of the pagan god Baal. Today, we've jumped ahead to the book of 2 Kings chapter 5. Elijah took on a disciple with the confusingly similar name of Elisha. Elisha followed his teacher Elijah until God took Elijah away in a chariot of fire in 2 Kings 2. Before Elijah left earth, his student Elisha famously asked to inherit a double portion of Elijah's spirit. I'm no expert on Hebrew language or ancient customs to fully understand all that Elisha means by this request, but the gist seems to be, give me the same spiritual authority and relationship with God that you have. Well, God grants his request, and we start to read about multiple miracles the prophet Elijah performs. Elisha continues his ministry in the same area Elijah serves, the northern kingdom of Israel. Remember last week I shared that Israel divided into two kingdoms after King Solomon died. The northern part became known as Israel, or sometimes called by its capital city of Samaria, and the southern kingdom became known by its dominant tribe, Judah, which had its capital in Jerusalem. It seems Elisha's ministry overlapped the reign of three different Israelite kings, Ahaziah, Joram, and Jehu, roughly between 853 and 814 BC. By the way, Jesus mentions two stories in Luke. I'm only covering the second one today, the one with Naaman the Syrian. It's not clear when today's story in 2 Kings 5 took place, because we don't learn the names of the two kings mentioned, which can serve as time markers for the story. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah would often fight with ancient neighbors, and sometimes they were the aggressors, other times their neighbors were, and they'd fight to control certain land or sometimes simply to force the other nation into submission, who would then start paying taxes to their conquerors. One of Israel's enemies was Aram, later known as Syria, which was the name Jesus used. In the very next chapter, 2 Kings chapter 6, we read about the king of Aram attacking Israel. We need to understand that Israel and Aram were enemies, usually with Aram being the aggressor, to see how weird this story is in 2 Kings 5. Starting in verse 1, "Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now, bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Just 3 verses already create multiple big questions. In verse 1, we read, Israel's God Yahweh had worked through Naaman to give Aram victories, presumably victories against countries like Israel. Some English translations make it easier to see the writer was referring to Yahweh by translating Lord in all caps. Whenever you see Lord in all caps, that's the translator's way of showing you the word Yahweh is used. Scripture says Yahweh had given a non-Jewish general his victories. Another big question here is Naaman's slave girl from Israel. She's been captured by Aramean raiding parties. Did Naaman lead the raiding parties? Possibly. We don't know. And we don't know how he treated this girl. Maybe he was exceptionally kind to her, but even the kindest slave owner will not be viewed highly by Jews if he owns other Jews who have been stolen from their homeland. A third question is why the captive Jewish girl is willing to show such kindness to her slave owner, offering what she believes is a surefire cure for his leprosy. Side note, the word leprosy in Hebrew could be translated for most any skin condition, not just Hansen's disease that we call leprosy today. Last, what gave this girl such faith in Elisha? She doesn't recommend seeing Elisha as something that might work. She's absolutely confident in both Elijah's ability to heal and his willingness to heal a famous general who's led battles against Israel. We don't have answers to any of these questions, and that's okay. Let's move on. Verse 4, Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means, go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." Y'all, this is weird. This famous general listens to the advice of an unnamed slave girl who's from an enemy country. Then the king of Aram also thinks this unnamed slave girl has good advice. And then the king sends Naaman with tremendous amounts of money. Talents and shekels were weights for measuring and counting precious metal. A talent was roughly equivalent to about 75 pounds, and a common conversion rate for talents into shekels was 3,000 shekels to 1 talent. That means he carried about 30,000 shekels of silver. Some Bible commentaries say a worker's annual wage back then might be equivalent to 100 shekels of gold, and Naaman is carrying 6,000 shekels of gold. The NIV Bible commentary says the gold and silver was equivalent to around $750 million in today's money. And I always think this last part of verse 5 is funny. And 10 sets of clothing. The clothes are coming from a king, so they're probably clothes fit for royalty, maybe made with expensive dyes and things like that. And who's all this intended for? The king of Israel, Aram's enemy. And the king of Aram includes this letter to the king of Israel explaining this whole thing like, "Hey man, long time no see. My buddy Naaman's got this skin condition. If you could please heal him, we'll pay you for it. Thanks. Catch you on the battlefield." This story is so weird. And the king of Israel sees it for the craziness it is. He knows he doesn't have the power to heal, and therefore thinks the king of Aram has done this merely to pick a fight with him under false pretexts. He's afraid the king of Aram will now have an excuse to attack once more because he doesn't heal Naaman. Verse 7, As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." Notice the king of Aram nearly starts another war because he doesn't listen to Naaman's servant girl. General Naaman understandably seeks permission from his king before entering enemy territory to seek out medical treatment. But the girl already told Naaman to see the prophet Elisha, not Israel's king. The king of Aram messes it up. You see, Aram's king thought the prophets in Israel worked like prophets and priests in any other country at the time, at the pleasure of and for the sake of the king. He assumes if Israel's king tells Elisha to heal Naaman, Elisha will heal Naaman. He doesn't understand servants of the one true God do not ultimately work for the government. They work for God and God alone. If God wanted Elisha to do something that the king also wanted, so be it. But Elisha did not work for the king. Then verse 8. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." Again, we have an unanswered question. How did Elisha hear about all this? We don't know. So the king of Israel sends Naaman to Elisha's house. You don't have to know much about the Bible to guess the Old Testament prophets didn't live in fancy homes. In fact, the very next chapter, 2 Kings chapter 6, there's this story where Elisha's students, his prophets in training, complain, "Look, the place where we meet with you is too small for us." Keep that in mind as we read verses 9 through 10. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." Horses were expensive military animals only used for battle and parades. Chariots cost big money and were only used for battle and parades too. This important general is probably traveling with dozens of people with expensive and impressive vehicles carrying millions of dollars. He drives up to Elisha's little house, and Elisha doesn't even bother to come to the door. He rather snootily sends a servant with instructions that would lead Naaman away from Elisha's house to go wash in a river. Now, Naaman got some hometown pride going on, and clearly he thinks the rivers back home are superior, but the Jordan River is a muddy mess. It is now, and apparently it wasn't much better in ancient times. Naaman understandably feels insulted. This poor prophet never comes out to greet this great man who's paraded into town and is ready to make Elisha unbelievably wealthy. But Elisha doesn't bother coming out of his 20 by 20 shack and sends a servant out to say, "Oh yeah, go down there and you'll get all fixed up." Why would Elisha act so rudely? Well, because he's trying to reveal something just below the surface in Naaman's character. Naaman sought healing for his skin condition, but Elisha wants to give a much greater healing only God can provide. My wife and I used to meet with a marriage counselor who often talked about the heat that comes in life. The marriage is fine when life is easy, but as soon as a little heat comes, the topsoil starts to crack, and you see if your roots run deep enough in God to withstand the heat. She was pulling her analogy from Jeremiah 17:7 and 8. "Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when the heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit." Elisha acts in some seemingly disrespectful ways to this great man to create some emotional heat. And we instantly see how Naaman responds when people don't follow his wishes and when things don't go his way. How do you respond when that happens? Verse 11 and 12. But Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hands over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Parphar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and went off in a rage. His hurt pride pushes him to give up and go back home, which would only hurt himself. He's close to receiving the healing he hoped for and has even been promised will happen, but he's willing to forgo it because it doesn't happen in a way that strokes his ego or go according to his plans. Can anyone relate? Thankfully, Naaman had some wise servants who risked their necks to speak sense into him. Naaman's servants went to him and said, My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, Wash and be cleansed? Well, even angry, prideful Naaman recognizes this is true. He strips off all his military garb, everything that made him look fancy, and heeded his servant's advice. So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. By the way, I could preach a whole sermon on the slow and tedious process God uses to heal us of the issues that cause the most sickness and dysfunction in our lives. What if Naaman had given up after the 6th time dipping in the Jordan because he didn't trust God's process? But that's a sermon for another time. Now notice Naaman's change in attitude once he's healed. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant. We get the idea. Naaman came here thinking all this money was payment, just like you'd pay any doctor for services. But his word here is gift. It's clear he now understands you can't pay the only true God. But he does want to show his gratitude through this gift. But verse 16 says, The prophet answered, As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing. And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. We don't learn why Elisha refused the gift. He's accepted gifts from others. We know that from the earlier chapter. But not this time. Maybe Elisha saw this money from Aram's king as blood money, since Aram has enriched itself by invading Israel. Or maybe Elisha wanted to avoid all confusion in Naaman's mind about Naaman's healing being a free gift of healing rather than a payment for services rendered. This was Naaman's first encounter with Yahweh and his ways. He came from a culture where gods and their representatives could essentially be bought with payment. I read a lot of missionary biographies. I think of Mary Slessor and David Livingstone in Africa in the mid to late 1800s. I remember stories where people would come to them for healing after the local witch doctor couldn't heal them or only made their illnesses worse. But before these witch doctors would drive out the supposed evil spirits, they required payment, often steep payment. Maybe Elisha wanted to ensure Naaman understood the one true God wasn't like any other God Naaman had ever met. You couldn't buy his services. And then Naaman requests something that probably sounds strange to our modern ears, especially those of us who've grown up in Protestant denominations rather than Christian groups like Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, or some sort of Middle Eastern Coptic Christianity. Verse 17, "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry. For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord." Modern American Christianity, especially most strains of evangelicalism, downplays, maybe overly downplays, any idea of sacred space. The same room that's used for basketball on weeknights is used for worship and communion on Sunday. In our own church, for example, we bring animals into our gym chapel during the week for our summer day camp and feeding program, but then it's used Saturday and Sunday for church services. But ancient Naaman doesn't think this way, especially since he didn't grow up believing in Yahweh, who traveled around a lot for an ancient god. To him, it makes sense to worship the God of Israel on the very soil of Israel. So he presumably took the soil home to build some sort of altar to God. And then your heart goes out to Yahweh's newest convert as he asks Elisha this next question in verse 18. "But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." Poor guy, he's just realized the God of Israel is the only true God. But seconds later, he's already confronted by the reality that he's part of this pagan religious system back home, which is also integrally tied to his job, his status, and probably his very life. He feels the pressure to continue with the same state religious practices he's been doing for years. He doesn't think he can just stop going with his king to the temple, so he plans to continue the outward forms, even though his inward attitude will now be different. And he understands the apparent hypocrisy and maybe even sin from doing this, so he asks Elijah's forgiveness. This is a real problem still around today. Anywhere people convert to Christianity where the dominant religion isn't Christianity. The country of Aram soon became known as Syria, and ancient Syria had similar boundaries to modern Syria. Today, Syria is a Muslim country. Suppose the number 2 in the Syrian government became a Christian. What's he supposed to do the next time Syria's president makes an official visit to a mosque and prays to the Muslim god Allah? When everyone else bows down on their prayer rug, will he still bow down too? Or what about a high-up government official in China, where a prerequisite for government office is being a member of the Chinese Communist Party, whose official religious stance is atheism? Or what about North Korea? Or what about certain subcultures and industries here in the U.S., where religion, especially Christianity, is viewed as a bunch of narrow-minded, intolerant, and scientifically impossible myths? Will you likely keep your job if your coworkers and superiors now think you're an intolerant bigot who believes ancient fairy tales? Naaman's story reminds us we should know the stories of our Christian brothers and sisters who live and work in places hostile to the faith, and we should pray for them often. Sometimes the Bible comes down with these extremely hard stances on what God's followers should do, especially when it comes to things like pagan idol worship. Other times, the Bible surprises us with its grace and flexibility. So what's Elisha's answer when Naaman requests forgiveness for future actions? For years, Bible scholars have wondered at Elisha's short response. Verse 19, "Go in peace," Elisha said. You've got to imagine Naaman would have appreciated a longer answer, or even the act of forgiveness he requested. In Hebrew, Elisha's response is just 2 words, and it literally translates "go in peace" or "peaceably." It seems most Bible scholars tend to read what they want into his reply. Those who think Naaman's outward behavior back at the temple of Rimmon didn't matter as long as his inward heart was right, think that's what Elisha was saying too. But those who take a more conservative stance, saying our outward actions definitely matter, say Elisha obviously thought bowing at the temple of Rimmon was wrong, but he didn't want Naaman to be overburdened with too many rules at once and trusted God would soon tell Naaman to stop. I don't know the right answer, y'all. But that's the story of Elisha and Naaman. The story continues on with Elisha's servant getting greedy and lying to Naaman to take some of Naaman's gift for himself. But we don't have time for that study today. I want to return to Jesus' words about Naaman in Luke 4. Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. Jesus contrasts Naaman with people in Nazareth, people who thought they knew Jesus and therefore refused to accept his message. The townspeople read between the lines and realize what he's saying, that God is no respecter of religious pedigree, outward behavior, or nationality, that God will save, heal, and work through anyone who accepts him when he comes to them, even if those individuals seem to be enemies of God's people. He's also saying an entire people in Elijah and Elisha's day and an entire town, Nazareth, in Jesus' day, miss God's saving work. In Elijah and Elisha's day, many of the people blatantly turned away from God, and plenty more thought they had God all figured out. They thought they knew what to do to stay on God's good side. And if you remember last week's message, still hedging their bets by participating in all the things in this world. In Jesus' day, no Jews in Israel worship pagan gods anymore. But they still created their own idols, this time in the form of Jewish law and the belief in a hyper-nationalism, that they were the only people God loved. In both cases, it reflects a form of arrogance. They refuse to follow God and God alone, instead adding their own additional gods to follow. The people in Jesus' day thought they knew everything they needed to know about Jesus. When you have all the answers, you don't spend any more time seeking the truth, do you? In Luke 18:17, Jesus said, "Anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." We have 2 boys at home. One just turned 7. The other is 3.5. Both ask a lot of questions, but the youngest one's questions never stop. At his age, he just subconsciously knows he doesn't have the answers. In many ways, there's a natural humility in little children. They ask for help when they need it and ask for answers when they don't have them. We saw from Naaman's reactions that he had some pride struggles, but when it matters most, we see God actually gave him a humble heart. If you've heard me teach, you know I've often mentioned how low ancient women were on the social hierarchy. And in pre-modern societies, where children died often, children weren't treated with much importance either. And most every ancient culture viewed their own culture and their own gods as superior. Yet Naaman took the advice of a young female slave from a different country with a different religion. He trusted her advice so much, he risked his own safety and livelihood by going to his king. We can't gloss over how strange Naaman's request could have sounded. A powerful general asks if he can make a personal visit to an enemy country. The king could have interpreted this as an attempt to defect. Finally, albeit reluctantly at first, Naaman listens to the strange advice of a prophet he's never met who serves a God he does not know. Why is Naaman willing to take advice from such unlikely people? Because he understands what he's been doing is not working. How many ancient remedies has he tried? How many pagan priests has he already paid to cast magic healing spells, waving their arms over him like he thought Elisha would do? A famous general like that who has the favor of his king obviously isn't short money, but all the riches couldn't heal him. In most ancient minds, surely this skin condition was due to angering the gods. How many extra sacrifices has he made to appease them? But none of it has worked. You get the idea. Naaman's servant girl might be a little exasperated when she says, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria." It makes you wonder how many times she's made that suggestion. But maybe he didn't have ears to hear until he'd hit rock bottom. He's probably exhausted every other possible solution. He's out of options. He's now desperate for healing any way he can get it. Sure, he had a momentary flare-up of pride outside Elisha's front door, but I think Naaman's desperation led him to the poverty of spirit Jesus mentions in the Sermon on the Mount. Naaman's king sent him off with all that wealth, but you get the idea. Naaman would have still made that journey without any of it. And that's what you need when you come to God. You need the humility like a little child who knows they need help and don't have the answers. Jesus tells us those who are poor in spirit will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Not those who behave right, who come from the right background, or who know a lot of Bible stories. It's the people like Naaman who give up trying their own solutions when God suddenly shows them it's not working for them. They're still just as sick and messed up as when they started trying to fix themselves. There's good news for those of us who feel like Naaman. In Mark 2:17, Jesus said, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners." If your plans and solutions keep failing, Scripture says today is the day of salvation. Today is the day you finally respond to Jesus' invitation to follow him, to accept the healing and forgiveness he offers. God's Spirit has been calling to you like Naaman's slave girl. If only you would come to me, you would be healed, forgiven of all your sins. Today is the day you pray to Jesus with a repentant attitude, what the Bible calls a poverty of spirit, where you admit you've got no remedies, no solutions, nothing to offer him, and you accept the healing only Jesus can offer, and trust in faith that he can do in you what you could never accomplish for yourself. If you make a decision to follow Jesus today, I would love to hear from you. Finally, for those of us who already follow Jesus, who believe we're already part of God's family, all those Jewish people who never sought Elisha's help in Israel, and the people in Jesus' hometown of Nazareth serve as a stern warning to us. Jesus reminds us it's not your religious past and pedigree that include you in God's family or allow God to work in your life, but it's your faith in God, whom we see most clearly in Jesus Christ. Unfortunately, without a humble faith in Jesus, we'll be like Nazareth. And Matthew 13:58 says, "And he did not do many miracles in Nazareth because of their lack of faith. Be like Naaman, who was sick and completely out of solutions, but trusted God's process for healing and salvation in that Jordan, a river that had symbolized physical salvation for Jews for generations. In the New Testament, Christians see in a roundabout way how the Jordan symbolically fits into our own salvation. Another prophet, John the Baptist, baptizes repentant people in that same river. Jesus begins his ministry by first being baptized by John. And then the Apostle Paul explains to early Christians, alluding to their own baptisms, and says they were baptized into Christ. This river, which marked the Hebrews' boundary into the promised land when they could finally rest from their wandering in the wilderness, and the river which later becomes a symbol for repentance with John the Baptist, finally morphs into Jesus as he gives us our promised rest as our repentant hearts turn to him. To borrow the words from the old Negro spiritual, Jesus is calling us today to follow Naaman's path and wade in the water. Jesus, the living and life-giving water. Today, Jesus is calling to each of us either to turn to him for the first time or return to him after straying. Humble your hearts like Naaman and listen to Jesus' call. Love you. Talk to you soon.